Eric was sitting on the veranda of his cozy house, enjoying the warm summer evening. The air was filled with the scent of flowers from the garden that Melissa had so carefully tended. He gazed thoughtfully at the sunset, reflecting on the years that had passed. The neighbor's cat was lazily passing by, stretching on the path. "Eric, darling, can you help me with dinner?" Melissa called from the kitchen. "Of course, honey. I'm on my way," he replied, getting up from his chair. Eric entered the house, smelling the freshly cooked dinner. Melissa was standing at the stove, gently stirring the sauce in a saucepan. Her smile always warmed his heart. "How can I help you?" "What is it?" he asked, coming closer and putting his arm around her waist. "Cut the bread, please, and set the table," Melissa replied, turning to him and kissing him gently on the cheek. "Laura has already come back from training. She is in the shower now. Matt and Sophia are playing in the yard." Eric went to the table, laying out plates and cutlery. A few minutes later, Laura joined him, with wet hair and in a sports uniform. "Hi, Dad. It was so difficult in training today," she sighed, sitting down at the table. "Hi, Laura. You're doing great for studying so hard," Eric praised her. "How do you like the new coach?" "She is strict, but fair. I think I can learn a lot from her," Laura smiled. Soon, Matt and Sophia burst into the house, laughing and shouting over each other. Dad, look what I found," Matt shouted joyfully, showing a large shell that he had discovered in the garden. "Wow, Matt, this is really a godsend," Eric admired, looking at his son's find. "And what did you do, Sophia?" "I was helping Matt look for shells," the girl replied seriously, straightening her curly hair. "Well done, you are such researchers." Eric smiled, feeling proud of his children. "Let's all sit down at the table. Dinner is ready," Melissa announced, setting out the dishes. The family gathered around the table, enjoying delicious food and lively conversation. Eric looked at his loved ones, feeling the warmth and love that filled his heart. "How was your day at work, dear?" Melissa asked, helping herself to a salad. "Everything is fine. An important project has been completed, and I have received praise from my superiors," Eric replied with pride. "How are you doing at home?" "Everything's great," Melissa replied, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Today I finally finished the flower garden that I had been planning for a long time. I think it will become a real decoration of our garden." "Great, I can't wait to see," Eric said, feeling his love for Melissa only grow. After dinner, the children went to do their homework, and Eric and Melissa stayed in the kitchen to clear the table. They talked about the future, about plans for the weekend, and Eric couldn't help but notice how happy and energetic his wife was. Later in the evening, when the children were already asleep, Eric and Melissa went out on the veranda, enjoying the silence of the night. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and it seemed that nothing could mar their happiness. "You know, I'm very happy that we have such wonderful children, and that we're together," Melissa said, snuggling up to Eric. "Me too, honey. You are everything to me," he replied, kissing the top of her head. They sat in silence, enjoying the moment. Eric thought about how lucky he was to have a family. Early one morning, when the first rays of the sun were just beginning to break through the curtains, Eric quietly got out of bed, trying not to wake Melissa, and went to the kitchen for a cup of coffee. Her phone was on the table, left charging. Eric accidentally brushed against it, and the screen lit up, showing several unread messages. Taking a quick glance, he noticed an unfamiliar name. "Is something wrong?" Melissa asked sleepily, appearing on the threshold of the kitchen and rubbing her eyes. "No, it's fine," Eric replied hastily, turning off the screen and handing her a cup of coffee. "I just accidentally touched your phone." Melissa smiled and accepted the coffee, suspecting nothing wrong. Eric pretended that everything was fine, but deep down he had a doubt. Who's this person who was texting Melissa so early in the morning? The days passed in the usual rhythm, but Eric could not get rid of the uneasy feeling. Melissa began to spend more time outside the house, referring to meetings with friends or shopping. He tried not to attach importance to it, but each time her absence caused him more and more questions. One evening, when Melissa returned home later than usual, Eric decided to talk to her. "Melissa, it seems to me that you've started spending too much time outside the house," he began carefully, sitting down next to her on the couch. "Oh, Eric, don't worry," she replied, avoiding his gaze. It's just a lot of things to do, you know how it is. But still, you leave a lot, and I'd like to know where you've been, Eric insisted, feeling his anxiety grow. Melissa took a deep breath and looked at him reproachfully. You don't trust me. What is it? She asked, her eyes filling with tears. I'm just trying to get everything done before the baby is born. It means so much to me. Eric felt remorse for his doubts and hugged her. I'm sorry, Melissa. I'm just worried about you and our unborn baby, he said, trying to calm her down. Nevertheless, his doubts did not disappear. He noticed that Melissa had become even more secretive, and her phone was constantly with her, which was unusual for her. One day, when Eric was at work, his brother Jason called him. Eric, we need to talk, he said. It's about Melissa. What happened? Eric asked, his heart beating faster. I'd rather see you in person. Come to my place tonight, Jason replied, and hung up. Eric was restless all day, his mind spinning around the conversation with Jason. When he finally arrived at his brother's house, Jason's wife Layla met him at the door with a sad expression on her face. Eric, come in, she said softly, inviting him inside. In the living room, Eric saw Jason sitting on the couch with a gloomy look. What happened? Eric asked again, feeling the tension build up. Eric, Leela, and I noticed something strange, Jason began. Melissa often dates one man. They spend a lot of time together, and it looks suspicious. Eric couldn't believe his ears. He could not imagine that his wife would do such a thing. Are you sure? What is it? He asked, his voice trembling. Yes, we've seen them several times, Leela confirmed. It was in different places of the city, and they looked too close. Eric felt the world crumble around him. He couldn't accept this information, but the doubts that had plagued him lately seemed justified now. Thank you for telling me, he said softly, getting up. I need to be alone and think about everything. When Eric returned home, he found Melissa in the kitchen. She was cooking dinner, humming to herself. Hello, dear. How was your day? What is it? She asked, smiling. Eric looked at her, trying to figure out if she could really betray him. He didn't know how to start a conversation, but he knew he couldn't keep quiet. Melissa, I need to talk to you, he finally said, feeling a lump in his throat preventing him from speaking. She turned to him, her smile gone. What's wrong, Eric? You look worried. I found out that you're dating some man, he said, trying to stay calm. What does this mean? Melissa turned pale and froze in place. She didn't know what to say, and Eric realized that his worst fears were beginning to be confirmed. It's not what you think, she finally whispered, avoiding his gaze. I'm just what? Eric interrupted her, his voice shaking with anger and pain. Explain to me what's going on. Melissa didn't have time to answer as their eldest daughter, Laura, entered the kitchen. Mom, Dad, what's going on? What is it? She asked, feeling the tension in the air. Nothing, dear, it's all right, Melissa replied quickly, trying to smile. Go to your room, we'll be done soon. Laura reluctantly left, leaving her parents alone. Eric didn't know what to do next. This night was for them the beginning of those changes that will completely turn their world upside down. Eric was sitting in his office, trying to focus on his work, but thoughts of his recent conversation with Melissa were bothering him. Everything he had learned seemed incredible. He decided that he could no longer live in ignorance and had to figure out the situation. In the evening, when the children were already asleep, Eric decided to talk to Melissa again. Melissa, I can't do this anymore, he began when they were alone. We need to have a serious talk. I need to know the truth. She avoided his gaze, her hands trembling. Eric, please, she began, but he interrupted her. No, no, please. Have you been cheating on me? His voice was firm, but there was pain in his eyes. Melissa lowered her head, her face contorted with emotion. Yes, she replied softly, tears streaming down her cheeks. I cheated on you. Eric felt his world crumbling. He got up and walked slowly to the window, trying to cope with the surging emotions. With whom? He asked, without turning to her. With a man you know, she replied, her voice trembling. This is James. Eric whirled around, his eyes wide. James? My friend? He couldn't believe his ears. Melissa was crying, her body shaking with sobs. I do not know how it happened, she sobbed. I was so lonely, and he was there for me. I can't explain it. Eric felt rage fill him. He grabbed his phone and dialed James's number. Eric, what are you doing? Melissa asked in a panic. I'm going to find out everything, he replied, waiting for an answer. Hello, Eric. James's voice came from the other end of the line. We need to talk, Eric said sharply. Right now. In my house. What happened? James asked, his voice worried. You know what happened, Eric replied and hung up. Half an hour later, James stood on Eric's doorstep, his face tense. Come in, Eric said dryly, letting him in. They went into the living room where Melissa was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. James, how could you? Eric asked, his voice shaking with anger. We are friends and you betrayed me. James lowered his head, his face expressing regret. Eric, I do not know what to say, he began. It was a huge mistake. A mistake? Eric cried out. You ruined our lives. James tried to get closer, but Eric raised his hand to stop him. I don't want to see you, he said. Go away and never come back. James nodded slowly and left the house, leaving Eric and Melissa in silence. Eric didn't know what to do next. He felt like his life had collapsed in an instant. There's something else I have to tell you, Melissa said softly. What else? Eric couldn't believe that anything could be worse. Our children, she began, her voice breaking. I'm not sure if the twins are yours. Eric froze, his heart stopped for a moment. What did you say? What is it? He asked, his voice as cold as ice. I'm not sure if the twins are your children, she repeated, her eyes filling with new tears. Eric felt the world collapse around him. He couldn't believe that his life had turned into this nightmare. I need time to realize that, he said, standing up. I'm going to Jason's. Melissa didn't try to stop him, realizing what she had done. Eric left the house and drove to his brother's house, not knowing what awaits him ahead. Eric couldn't sleep all night. His thoughts were full of doubts and pain. He felt his heart being torn apart. Eric, you should do a DNA test, Jason advised, sitting next to him in the kitchen. It's the only way to find out the truth. Eric nodded, realizing that his brother was right. The next day, Eric did a DNA test for the twins. Waiting for the results was excruciating, but he knew it was necessary. When the results finally came, his worst fears were confirmed. The twins were not his children. Eric felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. He didn't know how to deal with this truth. He loved these children, raised them as his own. How can I move on now? Melissa, he said when he got home. I got the test results. She looked at him with horror in her eyes, realizing that her world was also collapsing. The twins are not mine, he said calmly, although a storm of emotions was raging inside him. What do you say to that? Melissa fell to her knees, her sobs echoing through the house. Eric stood in front of her, feeling that their life would never be the same. Eric was sitting in the kitchen, trying to digest the results of the DNA test that confirmed his worst fears. His whole life seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. Anger, frustration, and endless pain seeped inside him. He knew he had to talk to Melissa and figure out what to do next. Melissa, we need to talk, Eric said it as she entered the kitchen, her face even paler than usual. Eric, I know you're hurting, she began, her voice trembling. But please listen to me. Listen. What is it? He asked, his voice full of bitterness. Do you want me to listen to you after everything that's happened? After I found out that the children I raised weren't mine? Melissa came closer, but he raised his hand to stop her. You betrayed me, he continued. And not only me, but also our children. You ruined everything we had. Eric, I made a mistake, she said, her eyes filling with tears. I was lonely, and so was James. He just happened to be there. I do not know how it all happened, but I still love you. Eric smiled bitterly. Do you like it? What is it? He asked. If you loved me, you wouldn't do this. You wouldn't let our children grow up in a lie. He got up and walked to the window, trying to control his emotions. Eric, please give me a chance to fix this, Melissa begged. I'll do whatever you say. He turned to her, his eyes full of pain. Fix it, he asked. How can you fix it? You cheated on me with my friend. You forced me to raise other people's children. It can't be fixed. Melissa fell to her knees, her sobs echoing through the room. Eric, I'm ready for anything. I'm going to therapy. We can start over. Please don't leave me, she begged. Eric looked at her, feeling his heart break. I need time to think about this, he said, his voice low. I can't make a decision right now. He left the house, leaving Melissa in tears. He knew he had to sort himself out and his feelings before making a final decision. A few days later, Eric was staying with his brother Jason. Leela and the children tried to support him, but he felt lonely and devastated. He didn't know how to move on. One evening, when Eric was sitting in the living room, Jason came up to him. Eric, how are you holding up? What is it? He asked, sitting down next to me. It's hard, Eric replied. I do not know how to handle this. You have to make a decision, Jason said. You can't live in this state. You need to move on. Eric nodded, realizing that his brother was right. He couldn't keep running away from his problems indefinitely. The next day, Eric decided to return home and talk to Melissa. When he entered the house, Melissa was sitting on the couch, her face exhausted from sleepless nights. Eric, she said softly when she saw him. I'm so glad you're back. Melissa, we need to talk, he said, sitting down across from her. I was thinking about us and our future. She listened intently, her eyes full of hope. I can't forgive you for what you did, he began. I love our children, and it will be difficult for me to part with them. But I can't live a lie anymore. Melissa nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I understand, she whispered, but what are we going to do next? I want a divorce, Eric said firmly. I can't be with you anymore. I can't live with this betrayal. Melissa covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. Eric felt his heart breaking, but he knew it was the only way out. We have to discuss custody of the children and the division of property, he continued. I want them to stay with me, at least the older ones. I agree, Melissa said through tears. I don't want to deprive you of the right to be with the children. Eric stood up, feeling his heart constrict with pain. I need a little time to organize everything, he said. I'm going to stay with Jason until we resolve all the issues. Melissa nodded silently, unable to say a word. Eric left the house, leaving behind the life that was so dear to him. He knew that hard times were ahead of him, but he also understood that this was a necessary step towards recovery and a new life. Returning to his brother, he began to plan his actions. He turned to a lawyer to discuss the divorce process and the division of property. His goal was to maintain relationships with children and ensure their future. A few days later, Eric returned home to pick up his things. Melissa tried not to make eye contact with him, realizing that everything had changed forever. I'll take the kids for the weekend, he said, gathering up his things. We're going to Jason's. Okay, she replied softly. Thank you for letting me see them. Eric looked at her, feeling a mixture of pain and pity. Melissa, I don't want to deprive you of your children, he said. But I can't live with you anymore. She nodded, unable to find the words. Eric left the house feeling that he had taken the first step towards a new life. There were difficult times ahead of him, but he was determined to cope with them. He knew that his children needed him, and he would do everything possible to ensure a happy future for them. Eric returned home to pick up the kids for the weekend. Melissa was sitting quietly on the couch, her face pale and exhausted. He felt his heart clench with pity, but he knew that this step was necessary. Are the kids ready? What is it? He asked, trying not to meet her eyes. Yes, they've already packed, Melissa replied, her voice low and hoarse. Laura, Matt, and Sophia ran into the room, hugging their father. Dad, we are so glad that we are going to Uncle Jason's. Laura exclaimed, her eyes shining with joy. Yes, dear, we're going to have a wonderful weekend. Eric smiled, feeling his heart warm with their joy. They left the house and Eric led the children to the car. When they were already in the car, Laura suddenly leaned towards him. Dad, I know Mom was wrong, but I love her anyway, she said softly. Eric looked at her, his eyes softened. I know, honey, he replied. And I love her too, despite everything. We'll find a way to deal with this together. They went to Jason's, enjoying the weekend. The children played with their cousins, and Eric and Jason spent time talking about the future. Leela tried to support them both by cooking delicious dishes and creating a cozy atmosphere. On Sunday evening, when Eric was about to return home with the children, he received an unexpected message from Melissa. "Eric, we need to talk urgently. It's important," he read and felt alarmed. He took the children back and left them with Leela, and went home himself. When he entered, Melissa was standing at the door, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. "What happened? What is it?" he asked, feeling his heart constrict with worry. "Eric, this is James," she began, her voice trembling. "He's threatening me. He demands that I go to him. Otherwise, he will tell everyone about our affair and ruin our life completely." Eric felt his anger rising. "What?" His voice was full of rage. "He dared to threaten you?" "Yes," Melissa whispered. "I do not know what to do. I'm afraid for the children and for myself." Eric took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "Don't worry," he said, taking her hand. "We'll figure it out. I'm not going to let him ruin our lives." Eric knew he had to do something. He called his lawyer and told him about the situation. "We need to act quickly," the lawyer said. "We can apply for a restraining order and protect your family." Eric agreed, and they began the process. A few days later, James received a notification that he should stay away from Melissa and the children. Eric felt his heart finally begin to calm down. But it wasn't the end. One evening, when Eric returned home, he found a note on the doorstep. "Eric, this is not the end. You don't know the whole truth." The note read. He felt a chill run down his spine. Who could have written this? He suspected it was James again, but he wasn't sure. The next day, Eric decided to visit James. He knew he had to figure it out. When he reached James's house, the door opened and James himself stood on the threshold. "Eric, what are you doing here?" "What is it?" he asked, his face expressing surprise and annoyance. "We need to talk," Eric said firmly. "I want to know the whole truth." James grinned and invited him in. "Okay, let's talk," he said, leading Eric into the living room. When they sat down, Eric looked at James and asked, "What do you mean you don't know the whole truth?" James looked at him ironically. "Do you think it's that simple? You don't know who your wife really is," he said, his voice full of contempt. "What do you mean by that?" Eric felt his patience running out. "Melissa wasn't just with me," James replied. "You don't know half of what was going on behind your back." Eric felt the world crumble around him. He couldn't believe his ears. His wife was involved in even more betrayal than he could have imagined. "You're lying," he said, his voice shaking with anger and pain. "Believe me, there's no point in me lying," James replied. "Maybe then you'll understand why I did it." Eric couldn't listen anymore. He got up and left the house, feeling like his world was finally collapsing. When he returned home, Melissa was waiting for him at the door. "What happened? What is it?" she asked, seeing his face. "James told me you weren't the only one with him," he replied, his voice low and tired. Melissa covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. "Eric, I didn't want you to find out like that," she said through tears. "I was in a terrible state, and it just got out of control." Eric stared at her, his heart tearing apart. "I can't take it anymore," he said softly. "I can't live a lie anymore. I need time to think about it." He left the house and drove to Jason's, feeling his heart constrict with pain and disappointment. Several months have passed. Eric and Melissa are divorced. He tried to improve his life, devoting all his time to children. But one day he received a letter that changed everything. "Eric, you deserve to know the truth. I've made a lot of mistakes, and you'll never know everything. But I hope that you can find the strength to forgive me." Melissa wrote. Eric felt his heart soften. He knew that he would never be able to forget the betrayal, but he also understood that he needed to move on for himself and his children. This story was the beginning of a new path, a path that was full of pain and disappointment, but also hope and love. Eric knew that there were still many difficulties ahead of him, but he was ready to overcome them. After all, he was ready to start a new life, free from lies and betrayal, a life in which he could be happy and give happiness to his children. That's how the story ended. Leave your opinion in the comments about this story. We will be interested to know what you think. Also, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss new exciting stories. Good luck to you.